Hello and welcome to the Anthony Collins Solicitors webinar on the NHF Code of Governance 2020. Today, I'm going to be presenting alongside my colleague Catherine Simpson, who is a Senior Associate in our Housing Governance team, alongside our colleagues Peter Hubbard, who is our Senior Partner, and Sarah Patrice. And Catherine and I are going to be talking to you today about the new NHF Code of Governance and hopefully answering all the questions that you thought you would have on this. But if after the presentation you have any further questions, you'd like to send them through to Catherine or to myself, or indeed to Sarah or Peter, then we'd be very happy indeed to answer those over email to you. So our contact details are on the screen here, and please don't hesitate to use them if you need to. So the purpose of this presentation is to explain in overview how the new code will work, so you can decide whether it's appropriate for your organisation to adopt it, and to challenge you in your thinking as to what you need to be looking out for. This session is not an exhaustive explanation of the new code, nor is it a detailed comparison to the 2015 code. It is the edited highlights. So the final version of the code was published a few weeks ago, and the first thing to note is the size of it. Not only is the 2020 code 80% longer than the 2015 one, but the additional guidance runs to 47 pages. The associated compliance checklist is more than twice as long as the 2015 one. Now it is 43 pages compared to its previous 21. So there's an awful lot to get stuck into in the new code. In this session, we're going to talk around the 4 principles that underpin the new code and the macro themes that you'll see it returning to again and again, including the focus on your residents. We'll talk about how this raises the bar for housing associations, and we'll talk about how and when to adopt the new code and the obligations around comply or explain as the continued approach. But before we start, it's worth dwelling for a moment on the language that's used in the NHF code. It's changed. In 2015, the code referred to tenants, whereas the 2020 code refers to residents. And this is defined in the code very purposefully as tenants, leaseholders, shared owners, and others living in the homes owned or managed by the organisation. Now, this is significant because the Social Housing White Paper, also known as the Charter for Social Housing Residents, uses the word tenant and occasionally resident throughout, but it applies it in that context to social housing tenants only. So arguably, the NHF code is wider in its scope than the White Paper and could, for example, include market rent tenants. And that's significant when you look at some of the expectations around organisations, particularly as to how you embed the tenant voice, the resident voice. The code is structured around 4 principles with a series of underpinning objectives which are intended to take you from principle to practice. The accompanying guidance notes expand on this even further and provide links to other guidance that the NHF thinks that you might find useful. It effectively raises the bar for housing associations, challenging you to move from a position of compliance with what you're told to comply with to regulation, and one where the board must identify its mission, devise its strategy, and deliver its plans. And we'll talk more about this in a moment. The other main themes of the NHF code include the needs and safety of residents, both current and future, and the fact that these are to be at the heart of the board's decision making, with residents to be encouraged and supported to influence and contribute to strategic decision making. There's a new focus on and accountability to residents that echoes the white paper. There's a clear and prominent emphasis on equality, diversity, and inclusion, which goes beyond the usual understanding of inclusion to include the need to have people with direct lived experience of or particular insight into your communities, and for these people to be meaningfully engaged in governance structures, and a commitment to achieving equality of opportunity, diversity, and inclusion in all of the organisation's activities. This is slightly diluted from the draft code that was published earlier in the summer, where it referenced specifically greater ED&I representation on the board or committee structure. But even so, it represents a huge challenge to some landlords. Resident and workforce safety in the continued aftermath of the Grenfell tragedy is recognised as an overarching priority, and there are strong read acrosses with the white paper, as you'll spot as we go through. So a quick history lesson. In 1994, the government of the time instigated a committee on standards in public life to advise the Prime Minister on ethical standards. Under its then chair, Lord Nolan, it created 7 principles of public life applying to anyone engaged in public office of any description, and these were selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. These are the principles that underpinned the previous NHF codes of governance. However, in the 2020 code, they're not expressly stated, and instead the code identifies 4 new principles. This isn't to say that the Nolan principles are dead. Through the work of previous codes and the regulatory framework, RPs have already embedded the 7 principles throughout their governance and operations. So the 2020 code specifies the 4 principles that are set out here. These reflect changes in company law and the UK Corporate Governance Code in that it's no longer about simply acting in good faith and the equivalent of meeting your fiduciary duties to your organisation, but actively planning for and promoting the success of the organisation. The mission and values principle requires boards to set and actively drive the organisation's social purpose, mission, values and ambitions, and through these embed within the organisation resident focus, inclusion, integrity, openness and accountability. The strategy and delivery principle requires the board to set the association's ambition, plans and strategies which enable you to fulfil your organisation's social purpose and remain viable and sustainable. The board's required to exercise demonstrable and effective oversight of its delivery. The third principle, board effectiveness, is intended to ensure that the organisation is led by a skilled and diverse board which regularly reviews and capably manages its own performance and effectiveness and ensures that it complies with the code. And then finally, control and assurance. The board actively manages the risks faced by the organisation and obtains robust assurances that controls are effective and that plans and compliance obligations are being delivered and that the organisation is financially viable. Because there are only 4 principles, they're easy to remember. The NHF have obviously looked at this from a very practical point of view. So let's drill down into the principles one at a time, and the first of these being mission and values. From principle to practice, which as I mentioned earlier forms part of the code, further divides this into 7 subcategories: mission, resident focus, equality, diversity and inclusion, culture, integrity, accountability, and reputation and trust. We've not got time to go into each of these individually today, but they each have a number of specific expectations on the board to embed throughout the organisation. For example, mission. The board sets and actively drives the organisation's social purpose and has to regularly review and reaffirm its relevance. Regularly in this context is clarified by the guidance notes that accompany the code. It shouldn't be more often than once every 3 months, but at least every 3 years. And we'd suggest on certain trigger events, for example, merger, you would need to review them again. Regarding resident focus, the needs and safety of your current and future residents and other customers are placed at the heart of the board's decision making. There are clear read acrosses here to the white paper, although as we noted earlier, that only applies to social housing tenants. You need to have policies to protect their safety, to hear their voice, and to include them in your governance and decision making. You need to report back to them regularly on things they need and want to know about. Accountability. You need to publish annually information about what you're doing and how you're doing it, and link this back to the social purpose, mission, ambitions, and values of the organisation. You need to seek feedback on this, and there's an expectation of continuous engagement with your stakeholders, particularly your tenants. You need to encourage independent scrutiny and be held accountable for what you do, and you need to share information about your organisation where you're requested to do so. And then regarding reputation, this is absolutely critical. Grenfell and the ongoing inquiry are landing some very hard blows on the social housing sector, and this is a key theme of the regulator's Sector Risks Profile 2020, which lists reputational risk as the principal strategic risk to RPs. Reputational risk, it says, is inextricably linked to all risks faced by a registered provider. So you're now obliged to take into account in your actions and decisions as board members the importance of maintaining trust and upholding the reputation of the organisation. We're now going to focus on 3 areas where Principle 1 really ramps up expectations, reflecting the direction of travel across public and private sector. We're going to look at ED&I, resident focus, and resident safety. Starting with equality, diversity, and inclusion. The code contains clear and prominent emphases on ED&I, which go beyond the usual understanding of inclusion. It requires you, the board, to demonstrate a clear and active commitment to achieve equality of opportunity, diversity and inclusion in all of your organisation's activities, as well as in the board's own composition. Historically, Boards have struggled to attract candidates from diverse backgrounds in enough numbers, although the changes in governance that the COVID pandemic has forced onto the sector knocked down a lot of walls in this respect. Board members may not need to live 45 minutes or fewer from your head office to be active participants, and so you do have access to a far wider pool of potential board members than you might even 8 months ago. There's some intersectionality questions for you here. You've got to make sure that you're not simply doubling up on roles to tick the box. For example, appointing a single BAME board member who is a resident may meet two separate expectations of the code, namely resident involvement and governance, and ED&I expectations. But this is generally not going to be sufficient to reflect the spirit of the code and of the white paper, and potentially inevitably of the new consumer regulation regime we're going to be facing. This is about ensuring plurality of views around the table, so you can be certain you understand and can meet the needs of all of your customers. Beyond governance, a bigger challenge may be to achieve equality of opportunity, diversity, and inclusion across all of your organisation's activities as the code expects. You'll need to consider very carefully how you're going to measure this and what you're going to need to do to achieve compliance. Aligned also together with Tenants' Charter and the Social Housing White Paper, the needs and safety of current and now future residents are to be at the heart of the board's decision making. It's strongly implicit, if not actively expected, that adopters of the code will also adopt together with tenants as a core plank of their resident focus. Under the code, residents are to be encouraged and supported to influence and contribute to the strategic direction of the organisation and also its decision making. There's a new focus on and accountability to residents that is not contained in the 2015 code, with the code clearly requiring that you should regularly report to your residents on how your commitments to resident focus have been delivered. Well, you will know much better than we do about how you can implement in detail direct resident accountability and bringing forward increased transparency for residents and gaining insights from them in order that they can contribute to your strategic decision making. You need to facilitate and enable independent resident scrutiny so that they can hold you to account, and you need to commit to review these arrangements regularly, at least every 3 years, but we'd probably suggest more frequently at first as you embed new arrangements. You need to make sure that they're working well. Of course, there'll be additional statutory obligations around tenant involvement as trailed by the white paper, particularly in relation to building safety. Which brings us nicely on to resident safety. We know from the white paper that the government intends to legislate for the active regulation of the consumer standards and that these will be rewritten by the regulator to reflect themes of tenant safety and tenant involvement. The regulator will police your compliance in much the same way as it currently does in respect of the economic standards. We know there'll be a close working relationship between the Ombudsman and the regulator, and we also know that the serious detriment test is going to be removed. So the challenges for your organisation will be around how you're putting residents at the heart of the board's decision making so as to ensure that their safety is paramount. Principle 2 relates to strategy. And for the first time, we see specific reference to carbon neutrality, environmental and social sustainability as things the board must give specific consideration to when setting its direction and strategy in order to deliver the organisation's purpose. In more than a passing nod to the amazing examples of partnership working across the housing, health, charitable and local government sectors in particular during 2020, you now need to actively consider collaboration with other organisations to deliver your social purpose and strategies. You also need to review the benefits and risks of your joint ventures annually and make sure that they're properly documented as to accountability, performance, compliance, risk management, and governance. Coterminous board structures are also mentioned, and there must be guidance and documentation to set out how board members must deal with their overlapping responsibilities and any resulting conflicts of interest, along with clearly documented protocols about how meetings are going to be conducted, serviced, and minuted. Finally, in a nod to the regulator's articulated concerns around boards not being in control because they don't have appropriate lines of sight over the whole business, there's a requirement for the board to have assurance as to the reliability of information that board members are provided with. Principle 3, board effectiveness. Delegations to staff, committees and subsidiaries now need to be clearly documented in a framework. This is perhaps to address some concerns on the part of the regulator around the relative informality of governance arrangements that have arisen during the pandemic and the risk of temporary measures becoming permanent. Where you do this, there must be a clear audit trail back to the board via formal delegations. The role of the Vice Chair or Senior Independent Director is specifically referenced, and it's interesting to note that there's also a requirement for a specific board member grievance and disputes policy. Echoing the focus on ED&I, you need to include people with diverse backgrounds and attributes within the governance structure. And finally, and controversially, we see the expectation around a maximum of 6 years on the board for directors, although this can be extended in exceptional circumstances. Note that it's always been an expectation that a board reconsiders its skills requirements regularly, and that board members whose skills are no longer needed are excused from duty. But this has not been the norm in the sector, and most board members have served a full term of 9 years. Given the need to ensure ED&I on the board and to reflect the tenant voice at the heart of governance, we should expect to see some board renewal within every organisation. It's undoubtedly the case that some boards and some board members may struggle to implement this rule without a little bit of heartache. Finally, Principle 4, Control and Assurance. There's not too much to say here other than that previous code led with compliance, whereas now it's the final section of the code. There's a reiteration of the risks that joint ventures and subsidiaries can import, and the need for those to be specifically included in your regular organisational risk reviews. As always, financial viability is paramount, and there is here a section on whistleblower protection for the first time. I'm now going to hand over to Catherine, who's going to take you through the practical implications of the new code.
Thank you, Victoria. So raising the bar. What are the changes here and where does this raise the bar for you? Moving to the 4 principles reframes expectations in our view. It reflects the shift from an informed volunteer board acting in good faith to a professional board promoting the success of the organisation. This is not about compliance with someone else's vision. It's about an empowered board setting the vision itself and a strategy that delivers its plans. The board is responsible for setting the culture of the organisation and displaying the behaviours needed to deliver the mission. The concept of stakeholder accountability is writ large, to residents mainly, but also to your workforce, as well as to third-party statutory partners. The expectations around the board being in control and this manifesting itself in a tight control over information supplied to it to ensure its accuracy, proper record keeping and accountability are all precursors to a new consumer regulation regime with teeth. The NHF does not want organisations to be caught on the back foot when that is introduced next year. So challenging the board and challenging yourselves. Culture. As mentioned a moment ago, there is a clear read across between good governance and a strong positive culture. This is the board's to set and own. In terms of structures, boards are required to actively consider whether changes to staffing, governance or structure could better deliver their RP's purpose. Collaboration. Boards are now required to consider as part of its corporate strategy whether and how collaborative working or formal partnerships could enable it to deliver its social purpose more effectively and economically. In terms of adopting the new code, it's important to note from the outset that it is not like an Apple update. You don't automatically upgrade to the newest NHF code as soon as it's published. You need to consciously choose to adopt it. The requirement under the Governance and Financial Viability Standard is to adopt and comply with an appropriate code of governance and that you have appropriate governance arrangements to establish and maintain clear roles, responsibilities and accountabilities for board, chair and chief executive. Whilst the norm in the housing sector is that this is the NHF code, there is no regulatory requirement for this to be the case and other codes are available. As the BBC would say, you could even write your own. Before you jump to adopt the NHF code, it is therefore worth considering the alternatives, particularly if you have a diverse business structure, including care and support or a significant amount of private sector activity, or for example, you have non-registered parent or are a for-profit RP, perhaps part of a wider profit-making corporate group. For today's purposes, the Principle 2 we've chosen are the UK Corporate Governance Code 2018 and the Charity Governance Code 2017. And separately, we are producing a detailed read across of the 3 codes, comparing and contrasting them, that you might find useful to your own considerations. We'll explain more about this later on. So the other codes of governance. The biggest selling point for the NHF Code of Governance is that it is written specifically for the housing sector and therefore aligns its expectations in a way as to support compliance with the regulatory framework and with some of the principles of the Social Housing White Paper, particularly regarding resident involvement and engagement and health and safety compliance. You can adopt it with relatively little bespoking to your organisation. It envisages and is both familiar and reassuring to stakeholders familiar with the sector, including funders. The UK Corporate Governance Code 2018 is the code typically followed by the private sector. It is mandatory for premium listed companies who have to follow a similar comply or explain approach to RPs, but many unlisted companies also choose to follow it. It encompasses the Waits Principles, which are a set of 6 high-level principles of corporate governance issued to help the largest private companies meet the recent legislative requirement to report on their corporate governance arrangements. The corporate code is, as you would expect, broad in general, reflecting the huge diversity of the private sector. You would therefore need some supplemental work to apply it to your business structure. A new 2020 Charity Governance Code was published very shortly after the NHF Code earlier this month. It is recommended for use by charities in England and Wales, although this is not mandatory. Rather than comply or explain, it instead advocates apply or explain, recognising the diversity of the sector. The same core principles apply to all charities, but they apply in different ways in terms of tailored good practice. Much of this code will also apply to other not-for-profit organisations that deliver a public or community benefit and those with a social purpose. Again, because of the breadth of organisation it seeks to serve, the Charity Governance Code is broad and high level in its principles, and you may need to tailor it to your own organisation. Finally, it's worth mentioning the Cooperative Corporate Governance Code, which applies specifically to cooperatives. So, timetable for implementation. Assuming you do want to adopt the NHF Code of Governance 2020, the additional guidance that accompanies it creates an expectation that RPs will move to adopt it as soon as possible. The NHF has set out, once the company secretary has familiarised themselves with the code, we suggest that a paper is brought to the earliest possible board meeting to recommend adoption of the new code. Then work can commence to ensure compliance. You therefore need to resolve at board level to adopt it, and in doing so, you set the clock running on compliance. A bit like when we triggered Article 50 before carrying out a proper analysis of how to do Brexit. You don't necessarily want to rush to adopt it before you've looked into it properly. Some RPs are still working to the 2010 code and have never upgraded to 2015. Presumably they didn't want to rush into anything. So the legal requirement is to have a code of governance and to stick with it. This last bit is crucial. If you are already compliant with the NHF Code 2015, that is not now obsolete overnight. You can continue to adopt the 2015 code, acknowledging an intention to move to the 2020 code once you are ready, and you will still be compliant with the Governance and Financial Viability Standard. Once you've adopted it, though, the expectation is that you will certify compliance or explain why you aren't, with the effect from the end of the following complete financial year in the accounts. So if you do adopt it in December 2020, you will be expected to certify compliance with it for the year 2021-2022, i.e. April 2022. So before you rush to adopt, it is really important to examine the 2020 code and to carry out a gap analysis. You may well find that you are not compliant in several ways with the new code. Some of this may be within your gift to address, albeit some work on your part. Others may, however, be beyond your control at the moment. You need to assess how much work becoming compliant will present and how achievable it is to cover this within 15 months, i.e. to April 2022, bearing in mind the current uncertainties over what 2021 will bring and the other challenges facing the sector, including the recovery from lockdown and COVID-19 over the past 10 months, and of course Brexit, which looms large over us, not to mention the consultation on and then implementation of a completely new, proactively regulated set of consumer standards by the regulator, as is required by the white paper. Bearing in mind the nature of the code, material non-compliance is likely to require the board and executive team to do some hard yards to solve. The question to ask yourselves is whether, bearing in mind the way governance is currently operating, board is capable of dedicating the space to this kind of thinking, and whether this is even possible virtually. Teams and Zoom typically work well for efficient operational decision-making, but lend themselves less well to the type of strategic and generative thinking that the board needs to carry out. Assuming that they are, and it is, how does this align with the other issues competing for board attention and headspace next year? If this is achievable, by all means move to adopt now as the code recommends. However, if you anticipate compliance is not going to be feasible to that timescale, you need to decide whether it is a better and more transparent outcome to adopt the new code and specify where you are at that point, not complying, bearing in mind this needs to be accompanied by an action plan to remedy the non-compliance, as well as a timetable for achieving this. Or whether it's more realistic to stick with the 2015 code and explain you are working towards compliance with the 2020 code. This doesn't mean that you can sit on your hands for the next 15 months, however. Even if you don't adopt the new code and don't choose to adopt a different one in preference, you still need to be taking active steps now to move towards compliance so you can adopt at the earliest opportunity, and especially for the financial year 2022 to 2023. If you make sure you are compliant with statutory obligations, for example, under the building safety and fire safety legislation when these come in, and your regulatory ones, for example, the new consumer regulation regime you have adopted together with tenants, then you will already be addressing many of the elemental differences between the 2015 code and the 2021. ED&I may be something you need to consider alongside these. In that case, you may or become, by the end of next financial year, more compliant with the 2020 code than you may have thought. We can offer support to you. Alongside this webinar, we're offering bespoke training for boards and executive teams on the contents of the NHF code as applied to by your organisation. We're also providing support on gap analysis and implementation plans to move you to a position of compliance. At this point, you may also find it useful to read across with what the other codes of governance we have referred to earlier contain. And to that end, we've produced a simple comparison document which sets out the key points covered by each code, the points of similarity and also points of divergence. If you would be interested in any of these, please do contact myself or Victoria Jardine after this session. If following this session you have any other queries or questions about any of the issues we've spoken about today, please do contact either Victoria Jardine or myself. Our details are set out at the beginning of the presentation, and your governance team should be able to provide you with a set of these slides for your review at your leisure. Thank you for listening.